I'm just going to say it. You don't need any more mix tips. Nobody needs any more mix tips. Hey, do not click that mix tip. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Progressions. My name is Travis Ference. I'm an engineer and mixer based here in Los Angeles with nearly 20 years of experience. Got some Grammy noms and number ones and all that accolade BS. But what's important to know for this video is I'm kind of old, like almost pre-internet old. And why that's important is that I learned to do this job before Mixtip YouTube and before social media. The access to information that is available today is amazing and should be empowering to all of us to learn basically everything. But there's one problem. Actually, let's not call it a problem. Let's call it a feature. There's one feature of this current era that I think we all need to be aware of so that it doesn't hold us back. So when I came to LA, it was 2006. I still bought CDs. The internet was for shreds videos. And social media was in its infancy. I think you still needed a college email to be on Facebook. So if you wanted to be a recording engineer, you basically had two choices. Go get a job in a studio or go to an audio school and then go get a job in a studio where you relearn everything you just paid to learn. So outside of some industry magazines like Sound on Sound, Mix, or Tape Op, there just wasn't a lot of access to knowledge about the craft without working in a studio and learning it from a person who learned it from another person who learned it from another person. I was fortunate in that I started my career at the legendary Capitol Studios in Hollywood. The people that I was learning from were some of the best that ever sat behind a recording console. I'll never forget the first time I walked into Studio A while a session was going. It blew my mind what it sounded like. It sounded like what I thought was a final mix, but it was just the band live off the floor during tracking. And watching those guys and listening to what they were doing, those were my mix tips. It's not actually that different from watching some tutorials on YouTube. I would just be off in the corner watching how the session went down the same way that you're watching a video right now. The difference was that there was no voiceover describing the process or zoom ins on the computer screen or anything like that. But in some ways it was better, right? Because you had to listen to try to understand why people were making the choices that they were making. Then after the session, if it felt appropriate, you could ask a few questions to the engineer or producer, look at the racks to see what kind of compression was going on, check out the EQ on the console, go in the live room, see where the mics ended up, and then you go home. And it's what happened when you got home that's the big difference between when I started and today. Once I got home, there was no content to watch. Sure, there were some blogs and books, but really what you did when you went home was you opened up whatever DAW you had and you just messed around, which wasn't always that exciting if you didn't have anything fun to play with, right? So we just never went home. We'd stay at the studio and play with gear all night. Everybody I knew in town who worked at a studio was always at that studio, whether you were getting paid or not. Because if you weren't at the studio, you probably weren't learning anything new. So you just always be there because you knew one day you would get thrown into the hot seat and have to put into practice everything that you'd just been watching up until that point. There's a great story about Jimmy Iovine, who is probably best known at this point as the Interscope Records label head who started Beats with Dr. Dre, which they ultimately sold to Apple for $3 billion. But in the 1970s, he was just a young assistant engineer at a record plant in New York. And he got a huge break when he was called in last minute on Easter Sunday to engineer because nobody else was available. He showed up at the studio to find out that the artist he was recording was John Lennon. And successfully making it through that session while also leaving an impression on John would set him on the course to work with everybody from Springsteen to U2. And that's a super common story on how so many engineers and producers got their start. They were suddenly thrust into a situation that mattered and had to go from observing and learning to doing. And usually at a very high level. Studio managers generally have a great read on who's ready and who isn't. And the good ones, they'll push those into a situation where they know that they can grow. So if you're asking yourself what this has to do with mix tips, that's fair. There's been a lot of setup here. The point I'm getting to is that today there is so much information that it's actually overwhelming how much you can learn. You can go deep down the rabbit hole and learn about how this person mixes vocals versus how that person mixes vocals. How this plugin compares to that plugin compares to the analog version. You can go on and on, constantly learning, but never doing. And that's the stark difference between the pre-internet era and today. 20 plus years ago, there was a ceiling to how much you could learn without doing it. Now, you can learn infinitely. But learning is not the same as doing. Earlier, I made a subtle comment about going to audio school and then relearning everything when you started in the studio. I believe that. Education, formal or not, is teaching you the foundational skills you need to go out into the real world and follow what is being done. You learn the basics so you can see a session in real life or on a video and digest why people are making choices, not ask, what are they doing? Mixtip YouTube is giving you the what and the how, which is important, but the why is going to be unique to each of us. And the only way to really learn that is to do it yourself. Example, slamming the input to a piece of equipment to distort it. That's the what you're doing and how you're doing it. But why you're doing it is your choice. Maybe it's because you like the tone of it. Maybe it's because it brings out an emotion in the part. Now let's go back to that assistant thrown into a session situation. There's an important thing that happens when you're pushed beyond your comfort zone and you pass the test. Confidence. And this is something that the internet cannot give you. In fact, this is where the access to information actually works against us. Think about this. How many times have you been working on music and thought, I wonder how insert hit producer name here does this? And don't say that you haven't. I have. I've been doing this for 20 years and I will stop mid-mix to check out how some great engineer does the same thing that I'm doing. And it's because knowing that we can makes us want to validate what we're doing. We don't always have total confidence in the things that we're doing inside our vacuum. Most of us are working alone. This wasn't the case 30, 40, or 50 years ago. Engineers did things and everybody in the room liked it or they didn't. There was immediate feedback to whether you were on the right path. And the more positive feedback you got, the more confident you became in your skills. A lot of us don't have that anymore. So many people are writing, recording, and mixing their own music, which is amazing. But the more isolated you are in that process, the more likely you are to turn to the internet to see whether you're doing the right thing, completely ignoring the fact that there is no right thing. This is why it's important to find your version of assistant thrown into a session, right? You have got to balance the ability to constantly learn and better yourself with taking action. Nothing will make you better than doing the thing. So to go all the way back to the beginning, this feature of Mixtip YouTube that I mentioned earlier that we need to be aware of so that it doesn't hold us back, it's the same feature that makes it amazing. The free and essentially unlimited amount of it. Now, it's hard to think that learning as much as you can about something isn't a good idea. But if you are using that learning to avoid doing because of a fear of failure or a lack of confidence, then in fact, learning is actually holding you back. No amount of learning will take away your fear. The only way to do that is to dive in and put yourself in situations to test yourself. This is the disadvantage of the internet information age. It doesn't force you to test yourself the way that that older apprenticeship or mentorship model would, which is why it's super important to recognize when you are avoiding taking a step outside your comfort zone. And I tell you this because I am fully guilty of this myself. I am no better than anyone else at these things. I may not do this in my audio career anymore, but when it comes to the podcast or YouTube, the creator side of my life, I have done this way too many times. The things I am doing right now are the things I should have done 3 years ago. So I encourage you to take a look at your life and see if there is anywhere that you are using learning to avoid doing. So if I've convinced you to step away from Mixtip YouTube for a bit and you want some rapid fire, non-technical advice, check out this episode where I share everything I've learned over the last 18 years about how to build a successful career in the recording industry.